There's a rather strong, common, and terribly wrong preconception about fighting games being nebulous and difficult to learn. With this approach to fighting games, you will be able to punch up much more easily and dominate almost everyone else around your level, regardless of the game that you're playing. I should mention this is for casual players and up who have an interest in the competitive aspect of the genre and want to feel like they have an idea of how they can improve at all times. You should never plateau hard following my advice, but it's okay if you get as far as you want to and just have fun at that point. So, to the point. To start off and see potentially explosive growth in learning fighting games, we need to use basic critical thinking skills, compartmentalize things, and then use simple problem-solving skills later on. Now, you don't need to be smart to do any of this, you just need to apply some focus for a moment. One of the main issues people have is being caught up in the exploration of the nuance and taking the basics for granted, or even forgetting them. Many players feel like they don't know where to start, so they don't have a foundation to work off of and know where to go from there. Humor me for now, but the best starting point is the goal of the game, the point of it, or how to win. It sounds like common sense that everyone who watches the game being played figures this out after a moment, a round, or a match. And it is, but this is the starting point from where we'll be asking questions and learning. Again, please bear with me as I'm going somewhere with this, and it applies to more than just raw beginners. So we know what the goal is, to reduce the opponent's health to 0. Next, ask how we can achieve that goal. Duh, it's by hitting the other player. How can you avoid being damaged yourself? Blocking either negates or mostly reduces the damage that you would take compared to being hit. How do you beat blocking? Throws can't be guarded. Just as I did, you can ask yourself what, when, where, why, and how, but you'll start with what and how, and then ask other questions when exploring the nuances of interactions. Without the game telling you what blocking is, you could still figure out how to do it by seeing the AI do it or doing it on accident. And everything else from there can be found on your own as well, with only a short amount of time and training. You can easily experiment what your moves do, and then have the AI set to block and go from there. If you change the dummy to block standing or crouching, you'll notice that there are attacks you need to block by holding back or down and back, and some moves cannot be guarded at all, which are typically throws. Lastly, you might notice that throws tend to have an incredibly short range, at least compared to attacks and fireballs, meaning that you have to make yourself vulnerable by approaching, and need to figure out how to make the opponent block first, which leads you to learning how to space your attacks out to beat the opponent's attacks, or out-attacking them. That is fighting game fundamentals in a nutshell. Everything else is exploring nuance. If you ask yourself questions like this in every situation you come upon, you will always be able to find answers and have a foundation to work from. For example, let's ask why to moving in to be able to throw the opponent. Through spending some time with a fighting game, you can see that each character has attacks of various sizes, and sometimes you either don't have anything that hits far away, or the attack or attacks that you have with any reach leave you vulnerable for a very long amount of time. In this case, you would rather be in a position where you are giving the opponent a rough time trying to defend against you, rather than out-attacking them, because otherwise you would be the one at disadvantage. Advantage and disadvantage are terms that you will hear often enough and are self-explanatory. Having the upper hand over your opponent is obviously better than not. Well-designed characters with range usually don't have anything that's threatening at a notable distance. Their options are meant to interrupt movement, as in hit you for trying to move into range to make them defend. Larger attacks tends to mean longer startup and longer recovery, so you can move around them. Approaching a character with more range than yours requires some patience and a little thinking ahead when moving to both avoid an enemy's attack and close the distance at the same time. The most recognizable example of this would be trying to deal with Ryu's or Gao's projectiles in Street Fighter without being anti-aired for jumping too late, or when they decide to not toss a projectile and wait to see what you do. So, let's ask why again, but about moving in to throw and playing as a character with better range. Why bother? Well, as I was just saying a moment ago, it's part of fair game design to allow shorter range characters to close the gap through being patient and taking educated risks. You cannot expect to always make the right decision, or always be right when taking educated guesses. So when you do knock the opponent down, or maybe anti-air in Street Fighter or King of Fighters, you'll have the same critical opportunity to make the opponent's time defending difficult. This leads into the topic of knocking the opponent down or similar, as well as introducing the concept of identifying smaller goals to help achieve the larger goal of winning. One of the most easily identifiable goals in fighting games is to knock the opponent down, or put them into a similar state of being unable to act for a long time with a predictable point of recovery. Not every fighting game has traditional knockdowns, but this logic can be applied to every fighting game. The point of a knockdown is to have more time to set up whatever you want while the opponent cannot act, then make the opponent choose between limited options in that moment. This is actually just an extension of the idea of hitting the opponent with an attack where you recover first. The only difference is that the attacks that knock down typically give you much more time to act in comparison to a jab. If your game doesn't commonly have traditional knockdowns like BlazBlue or Skullgirls, there are still similar enough moments that you can work from without needing the frame data. Knocking the opponent down is our first small goal, so you can work backwards from there by asking yourself questions and taking a moment to think about what your attacks do. What attacks of yours knock the opponent down, or leave them stunned for a longer period of time? What are the relative sizes and speeds of those attacks? What combos into the knockdown attacks, if anything? How vulnerable are you if you miss those attacks? There are many questions to ask for a variety of things, but you will find answers by patiently taking it one step at a time and keeping it simple. You don't have to just fish for knockdowns. Going out of your way to hit with specific moves makes you predictable, so you should also have other smaller goals to work towards. The starting point is asking what else there is to interact with besides the opponent's health bar. The answer to this is different from game to game, but one staple of the genre to start with is meter. Your game might have a different word for it, but the concept is universal. Meter typically increases when your attacks connect with the opponent somehow, be it hitting or being guarded, and likewise when you are hit or when you guard. Otherwise, the specifics depend on the game, and only take a minute or so of looking up how it works. If you don't feel comfortable trying to knock the opponent down, maybe you can settle for gaining meter through exchanging hits, or taking advantage of a defending opponent waiting for you to commit to a move closer or to an attack that leaves you more vulnerable. As to why you would build meter, meter gives you access to more options at certain mounts, like EX attacks and supers. Having more options to deal with what the opponent has means you have a better chance of gaining advantage over them. You can find or make up your own smaller goals like this by looking at other resources or mechanics in the game, thinking about how they work, then asking yourself questions about how you can interact with said resources or mechanics. The list goes on. However, you should now be prepared enough to do the rest on your own, learn, and think for yourself without needing someone or the game to tell you what to do or why. Again, break the game down into digestible parts, ask questions and think about how those parts relate or interact with each other, and then take things one step at a time. It will take time to learn what everything does in a given fighting game, but memorization is mostly a matter of time and not about difficulty. You spend the time learning what different moves do in your first fighting game to actually memorize patterns to recognize. Then you can take that to every other game and memorize things faster that way. Prioritize moves you commonly have to deal with that give you trouble, then work from there either on your own time or when you're faced with a new attack that gives you problems. You don't need the memorized frame data, just concepts like a move being advantageous or not when guarded, invincibility, and so on. Anyone can learn fighting games if they have the interest. Keep it simple, take things at your own pace, and mildly apply yourself.